Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we are here for my MSI Winners Finals overview and analysis video, and I have really been waiting for this one. You could argue this is maybe the most hyped matchup of the entire tournament up until this point, because even though it is a domestic matchup between two teams from the same region, we didn't actually get to see these two teams face off in the quote-unquote playoffs, the road to MSI, because there wasn't really a real playoffs for the LCK, which makes this really kind of the de facto finals of the LCK to determine who the best team actually is. I'm incredibly excited to see where it ends up going. These are probably the two most, historic and important organizations in League of Legends at the current moment, at least in the modern era. And it always is fun when these two go head to head with the two biggest players in the world right now. So I'm excited. I hope you guys are as well. If you are, let me know down in the comments section below. What did you expect from this series? Did it live up to your expectations, or were you surprised by the outcome? I know obviously I had some thoughts and opinions going into this series. We'll see what ends up happening with those, but I'm always curious to know what you guys thought as well. But let's go ahead and get into things. If you are new here, what we're going to do is go game by game, talking about the advantages and disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the game and a dud of the game for each individual game that we cover, and at the end of the series, I will be giving a player of the series to tie everything into a nice, neat little bow. Of course, we'll be looking at the bracket. That's quite a big deal, because the winner of today will immediately be slotted into the finals of MSI. They will only have one more series to play before potentially crowning themselves as champions, and definitely whoever wins this will be going into that finals as the favorite. The loser is not out. They have not expended their extra life just yet. These are the last two teams that have yet to lose in a series in the main stage of MSI, and so obviously whoever loses just goes down to the semifinals and has to earn their way back in to the finals, but definitely not out. It's definitely not over for whoever loses. I think it's pretty reasonable to expect both of these teams to continue to find a lot of success moving forward, but most of today will be spent talking about this series, and it's rightfully so, because it's a big one. I've hyped it up enough. It's a matchup between the number 1 seed from the LCK in Gen.G and the number 2 seed from the LCK in T1. If you really wanted an example that the LCK is in a great spot right now, I think this is it. I know that there were points in Winter, in particular in Winter, where I was like, man, are the 4 or 5 best teams in the world all in the LCK? Now, this is when, D plus Kia was doing really well. This is when, obviously, all of the big 3 in the LCK were doing well: Gen.G, Hanwha Life, and T1. There were teams like, KT Rolster was underperforming, but you had circumstances now where KT Rolster has really started to push themselves back into that conversation. So it's just been really interesting, I would say, to see the LCK over the course of this year. I think some of that is equalized out a bit, and I think generally the bracket setup was not very favorable to anyone's Legend to give them a chance to kind of get to winners finals, having to face Gen.G in round 2, but this could be the 2 best teams in the world going head to head. Certainly the 2 that, like I said earlier, are kind of the most famous, the most era-defining of this modern era, and I think it's because you have the 2 most popular and famous players in the world. You've got Faker for T1, you've got Chovy for Gen.G, and it's always fun to see them go toe-to-toe internationally. They've only played once in a best-of-5 internationally. That was at Worlds last year in the semifinals, where Faker was able to overcome Gen.G and, take Chovy out. I think a lot of people were looking at that as like that was Chovy's moment to really emerge, and it didn't quite happen. I believe the only other time Chovy and Faker have ever played against each other internationally was 2023 Worlds in a best-of-1 in the Swiss stage. Correct me if I'm wrong, they might have played before that, but I believe that was the first time they ever played. Gen.G, of course, won that best-of-1. Didn't really matter. T1 won the tournament, so, whatever you want to take away from that. But it's always cool to see, these 2 titans of the game, really the 2 faces of the game, go toe-to-toe on the international stage, kind of representing their regions. And I think this matchup in particular is really interesting, because I honestly think these 2 are coming at this series from similar yet entirely different motivations. Gen.G was a team that struggled a lot more in Winter than people thought they were going to until the playoffs. And even in the playoffs, right, they didn't look like a team that was going to be figuring it out. They probably should have lost to Nongshim Red Force in the lower bracket, getting 4th place in the Winter split. They barely edge out that series because Nongshim ends up throwing it away, and then they randomly upset D plus Kia in the lower bracket finals to make the finals and actually start to push Hanwha Life. They're not able to overcome HLE because HLE is just, Game 5 merchants. Now that Gen.G have become the Game 5 merchants, it's obviously a pretty funny thing to say, but this was a team that started off spring coming from like a really interesting perspective of like, is this team overhyped? Was the playoff run justified? Are they actually actually going to be a top 2 team in the LCK, and then they go undefeated in the spring split. They don't lose a single series, not only in the regular season, but they win their one playoff series to qualify as the number 1 seed. They're still undefeated at this tournament, I believe 21-0 in terms of series coming into this, so they're about as hot can get, and yet somehow, some way, we're saying that they're not in form, which is kind of correct. They had a huge layover in between their last game of the LCK, like their series against Hanwha Life, and their first series of MSI, the longest stretch without actual stage action of any team at this tournament, and it really made you wonder, like, what exactly was the form going to be for Gen.G? We knew they came in very jet-lagged against G2, and obviously G2 was bad, so they didn't really struggle with that, even though they were in bad form, but they go up against Anyone's Legend. They're taken all the way to 5 games. I think that series was very high quality. I think Gen.G showed a lot of the positive traits that led me to call them the best team in the world by a pretty considerable margin, but still, they went to 5 games against Anyone's Legend. This is not a team that's blowing out the competition and proving that beyond a shadow of a doubt, they're the best team at this tournament, and I know there's been some concerns about whether or not Gen.G is in the same kind of form that even a team like T1 is in, and while T1 also had a pretty big break in between the end of the LCK and the start of MSI, because that's just how the format ended up going. Very dumb format, all things considered. They are in significantly better form, I would say, coming into this tournament in terms of what they were for most of the split. You have to remember, this is T1, and they're following the T1 formula, which is to say that I don't know if it's just because they don't try in the LCK, if it's because they're not attempting to win, if it's just something about leveling up at international tournaments. I don't know what it is, but this team once again followed the formula of being a team that was clearly outside of the upper echelon in the LCK for all of this year, and then randomly making it to an international tournament by winning a series against a team that they are not better than, or at least haven't been better than for most of this year. In this case, it was Hanwha Life destroying them 3-0 in that final series to qualify, and then being really good at the international tournament. At this point, I can't even really say I'm surprised. T1 is still one of the best teams in the world in terms of their production when it matters the most. They're just not going to show you that on a game-to-game basis, and that's what makes this so interesting, is that T1 is kind of the team that everyone expects to do well internationally, but hasn't exactly had the reputation of dominating domestically in the same kind of way. Gen.G, obviously a team that has massacred the domestic league in the LCK for many years, but has never really been able to grasp like true international dominance, especially over T1, who's kind of been their international kryptonite, even though they've consistently been able to beat them domestically. So that's why this is always such a fun matchup, and I think when you're looking at the lanes, it really does get even more interesting. You have players like Canyon versus Owner. Owner's been awesome for T1 across this year. He's been pretty good at this tournament, maybe not quite as important as he was in the LCK because the rest of the team has stepped up, and so his role has naturally diminished, not in a bad way, just in that, you know, he can actually rely on his teammates a tad bit more, but Canyon, the highest highs of any jungler in the world, even if those inconsistencies are absolutely still going to be there. You have Keen versus Doran. This is a very historic matchup in terms of top lane playoff performances in the LCK. I know people think about Zeus versus Doran as kind of the big top lane rivalry. I would argue Keen and Doran has kind of been more interesting over the past couple of years, regardless of which teams these two players have been on. It's very fun to watch them go head to head. You have Ruler versus Gumayushi. These are two of the more stable AD carries in the world, two of the better ones at playing weak side. Ruler obviously a mid-game powerhouse, Gumayushi a lane, a 2v2 dominant powerhouse, and can even really win a lot in the 1v2 as well. You have Keria versus the young upstart Enduro that I've been going to bat for, and of course, Chovy versus Faker. Like, how can you not be excited for Chovy versus Faker on the international stage to see who can come out on top? I've postured enough. My prediction in this series was Gen.G 3-2 because it's basically impossible to bet against Gen.G, but honestly, these two teams always go to 5 games. Even if I don't think on paper it would show that T1 can go to 5, it's just how it goes. Like, every single time I've watched enough LCK to know that both of these teams and every top LCK team is a Game 5 merchant type of team, and I expect no less from these two teams internationally, and honestly, either can take a Game 5. So I'm excited to see what ends up happening, but the only way to know how it plays out is to go game by game, and that means starting with game number 1. So let's get into it. The winner of game number 1 was Gen.G. They are going to take game number 1. They're going to go up in this series 1-0, and obviously this is a huge victory to start off the series. It's great to get some momentum going in their favor because you need to be able to kind of put the gas pedal on T1 as quickly as possible. This was something I tweeted out over the course of this game, but there is a reason that I think Gen.G has had so much success being able to take down T1 in a lot of their best of fives, even in their best of threes that they play in the regular season. And that's because I think stylistically they actually match up very well into T1. What is Gen.G really good at as a team? Well, they're really good at slowing the pace of the game down. They're the best slow-paced team in the world, and it's not particularly close. There's really nobody who's able to control the map in the same way that Gen.G is able to do it as consistently as they're able to do it. And on top of that, obviously, they have ridiculous hands. And so oftentimes, even in these slow-paced games, there's not a lot of action, there's not a lot of chaos, and yet they still have a 1.5, 2K gold lead going into 15, 20 minutes into the game. And that's all just based off the fact that their laners are so good. The reason that's so tough for T1 is what T1 does at an elite level, an all-time level, the best of all time kind of level, is take advantage of mistakes. There is no team in the history of League of Legends that has ever been able to capitalize on mispositions and bad plays quite like T1 has been able to do over the past couple of years, and that's because they're so good at forcing those mistakes, at forcing opposing teams to make decisions, to pick a side, and oftentimes if they choose wrong, or even if they just choose slow, they're going to be behind the 8 ball when it comes to T1 because they're so decisive. The problem specifically for T1 in this instance is that not only does Gen.G very rarely make a ton of egregious mistakes in the late game, in fact, I would say they're the most controlled team in the entire world in terms of how they play, you know, barring some random international mistakes, some uncharacteristic mistakes that they made specifically in the semifinals last year, but also they're a team that doesn't really allow T1 to get map pressure, and that's what T1 likes to have. They like to be able to control the map and, again, force the enemy team into making decisions, and T1 can't really do that when they're down 2K gold into Gen.G. That's why I tweeted out, the way T1 wins games against Gen.G super consistently is winning early, which doesn't necessarily feel like a T1 style of, you know, gameplay, but when T1 can get a gold lead, when they are up, you know, even just 1K, even 1.5K at 20 minutes, they are so much more comfortable at being able to play the map, and Gen.G don't really have a ton of responses because they don't usually have to play from behind, and so it ends up creating this dichotomy, which makes it so concerning and confusing to me that T1 opts into playing Sejuani Azir in game number 1 against a Gen.G comp that has Gwen, that has Annie, that has Wukong, that has Duro on Nico, so many playmaking tools to be able to create all the pressure in the world. T1 is basically ceding pressure in the early game to a team that's so consistent at playing out the mid to late game. I really don't like this call. I think it's kind of a mistake. Overall, draft-wise, I don't think it's a bad draft. Obviously, you outscale. You get to a point where you're going to be able to fight a lot more consistently here, specifically because of the Azir getting strong. Azir Xayah is a very famous duo for a reason. This is a comp straight out of 2019 in terms of how things are executed. The problem is that Gen.G have so many playmaking tools in this draft that they're able to utilize, and I think their lane matchups are incredibly good. I think Gwen's in a great spot this game. I think Gwen is majorly underplayed at this tournament. I was very critical of teams like FlyQuest for just completely ignoring Gwen throughout the entirety of their series. Annie is awesome as an answer to Azir. I think this is one of the best Annie Wukong matchups in the entire game, is Azir plus tank, like trying to play for late game because the amount of playmaking you have as the Annie is just ridiculously high. Jhin is a great answer to Xayah because he's just so stable down in the bot lane, and Duro can be a big playmaker on something like Nico. Again, I just think Gen.G's draft is a little bit better in terms of the tools that they have to execute on, and I think specifically for this matchup, T1 is clearly hoping and praying to be able to get to the later part of the game because you drafted a full late game comp that wants to play front to back, you know, and maybe have Jax in a side lane, or yeah, I would expect Jax is diving onto the back line here as his role, but the Sejuani and the Rakan are kind of playmakers for the Azir and the Xayah to be able to take over team fights, and I just don't know you're ever going to get there against Gen.G, so that's my biggest flaw with the T1 draft, and that's why I think it was kind of difficult for them to be able to play out this game, but you still have to go out there and execute, and I think Gen.G did that with flying colors. Duro's going to get player of the game for me on the Nico. Really awesome game from him. I think it's going to be underrated just how good he was. It wasn't just the ultimates. Oftentimes, when you're talking about Nico player of the games, you're looking at big 3 or 4-man ults, and there were a couple from Duro throughout this game. I can think of one in particular that was really exceptionally good around, I think, 3rd Dragon in this game. That was just absolutely ginormous. Obviously, the big pick onto Faker in the bot lane was also big from Duro, although part of that was Faker's fault, which we will talk about. But Duro had a really nice game on the Nico, and I know people were talking about this bot lane as potentially being a weak link for Gen.G going into this tournament. I've never agreed with that assessment. Ruler was somebody who I thought was undervalued coming into this tournament. People talked about his quote-unquote bad form, and I think people were just over-hating on somebody that has such high expectations, right? Was Ruler perfect? No, he was not the perfect AD carry across this year. But are we going to pretend like this guy was not a top 380 carry in the world for most of this year? I don't see, the tape doesn't show anything else, right? Like Ruler did so much. I know it's kind of, positive to, or I guess common to take away credit from players on good teams, and I've been guilty of doing that in the past as well, but Ruler is not the kind of player that you should be doing that into. He ends up getting a quadra on the Jin, and Duro, I think, is part of that negativity as well. I don't think people watched a lot of Gen.G in the spring split. Like, I just don't believe you can watch that and see Ruler and Duro as liabilities for Gen.G. I just really don't think that that is the case. I know a lot of analysts are saying, other things, analysts that have watched the LCK, but I guess we just have to agree to disagree, because I did not see it on game tape. I watched every single game of this team this year, and I think Duro made some incredible highlight plays. I think Ruler had some incredible games, and I think they're just showing what they've been showing all year long right now at MSI. It wasn't just them, though. I thought Keen had a great game on the Gwen. A ton of damage coming down from that Gwen throughout a lot of these team fights. Was really able to stabilize the mid game for this team with a couple of really nice flank angles and just generally being able to clean up fights. Of course, credit to Duro for starting those fights and Canyon for being able to push those fights forward, but Keen was often the one that was kind of cleaning them up. Canyon and Chovy had good games overall. Chovy stepped a little too far forward a couple of times in the mid game. Once he burned Flash top lane, it was kind of a disaster. He ends up getting flashed on by Doran and then, dying in the mid lane. That one was not his fault, but there were 3 or 4 unbelievably good ultimates and stuns from him this game that set up everything else for the rest of these fights. He even zoned Faker out of an entire exchange in the middle of the map, which is absolutely huge for Gen.G, and so I don't want to sit here and pretend like Chovy had a bad game. He was definitely better than Faker on the other side of this. Gen.G was just more controlled and better, even though they gave over some control in the early game. This was just a good showing. And then for T1, this was just a really poorly executed game. Like, there's really nothing else to say. Sorry, Faker fans, he's done of the game for game number 1. I expect him to do better than this as we move forward, but this was a pretty terrible game number 1 from Faker. 2 really big mistakes, although I think there were quite a few minor mistakes throughout a lot of this game, but the 2 big ones, first off, obviously the fight around Grubs was horrible from Faker. Not only does he go in way too quick and basically, force his team into a fight in a situation that they can't actually play, but he Shuriman shuffles the Wukong clone and gets absolutely nothing else out of the play and instantly dies. It's doomed. Like, the entire game is kind of over from that point. That's a game-losing play from Faker, but also getting caught in the bot lane. And I know some people are going to be like, well, he tried to, ult Duro out of there and make sure the Nico can't catch him out. He had flash that entire exchange. He never used it. He just did not flash the Nico ultimate. He ends up dying. That gives over third dragon, one of those two, and it ends up just being another really back-breaking play. Faker was just not very good. In this game, he made some pretty major mistakes, and he's going to have to be better moving forward. For him to do it on something like Azir that he's had so much practice on, not really that great of a sign. Of course, there were some problems elsewhere. I don't think Carry had that great of a game on the Rakan. Duro was much more active on the Nico with all of the game pressure he had. Owner was pretty bad on the Sejuani. He just couldn't really do anything. Once his team falls behind, it's hard to play. But again, like, T1 lost in a lot of key fights, especially around Grubs, and then they started giving over a ton of objectives like those dragons, so that Mountain Soul going over to Gen.G basically made this unplayable. There's no way to ever kill Wukong Gwen once Mountain Soul ends up coming across. So for T1, I think you just need to draft something that can give you a bit more control in the early part of the game. I really think that ceding control in the early game to Gen.G is paramount to just instantly losing. You can't really draft like that against this team and get away with it. And for Gen.G, obviously, it's awesome that they had pressure in this one, but I imagine things will get more difficult as T1 perhaps drafts something a little bit more aggressive. So interested to see how it goes on. I'm expecting T1 to bounce back because, again, that's just how it goes. Like, this series is never just a blowout. It's not really how these two teams operate. So we'll see if Gen.G can kind of flip that script and go up 2-0, or if T1 is going to be able to tie things up at 1 apiece, because the winner of game number 2 was T1. They are going to take game number 2. They're going to tie up the series at 1 apiece, and of course they do. Of course they tie up the series. It's never a blowout between these two teams. I cannot stress that enough. It's just not how they operate. But this one, as much as it was a great T1 game, and I do want to give them a lot of credit because they did a lot of great things, Gen.G completely lost their minds here. Like, this was just one of those games where you ask, like, why is Gen.G why are they like this? Like, why are you doing this, man? Why do you play so different internationally than you do domestically? You don't make these kinds of mistakes domestically. You do sometimes, but for the most part, this team is so controlled and so smart about their win conditions domestically, and then they go to MSI and they just lose all sight of how they want to play the game. This was awful from Gen.G. Genuinely one of the worst games they've played all year long, which is a very concerning sign. Maybe they just wanted it to be a close series. Maybe they're just donating game number 2 to allow this to be a lot closer because they know viewership is going to be better if we go to game 4, game game 5 in a series like this, but absolutely disgusting stuff, quite frankly, from Gen.G in terms of execution. But let's talk about draft. I mean, it's very clear where both of these teams are indexing. It's basically a flip of game number 1, which I think is more so in favor of T1 in the fact that they have Talia, Lucian, and Jarvan. They're able to make a lot more plays in the early game, but they kind of have to because they do inevitably get outscaled by Rumble, Rise, Skarner, Rel in terms of frontline and engage. It's going to be difficult for T1 to be able to win late game team fights if they don't have a ton of damage coming out from the Lucian, which is hard to do unless he's super far ahead. Now, obviously, this is the kind of thing I want T1 to draft. I've kind of been very vocal about that because I think T1's biggest chance to be able to win this series is not going late game against Gen.G. I think they are, for the most part, just a better team at playing slow. And so for T1, I do think it's better for them to put their foot on the gas in terms of their draft, and that's exactly what they did. But there are some ways that this could potentially go wrong because, like I said, the scaling does get out of control. But this is a good draft if you are trying to win early. I think you're looking at 3 winning lanes. Ornn is going to be able to completely shut down Rumble. Rumble had a pretty big gold lead in this one. Part of that was donated kills coming over from T1 and Keen doing a good job of cleaning up fights once again like he did in game 1. Part of that is just that Ornn can't really compete with Rumble super early on in the game, but Doran was more useful in the late game. I will definitely talk about that. And then, Talia's obviously great in Rise. She's able to move around the map a lot more efficiently, at least in the early game, especially once Rise does not have Realm Warp. It's a lot more difficult for him to play the game. Guma's obviously going to have pressure into the Ezreal. He's going to be fine in surviving, but it's going to be difficult for him to actually fight back at any point. Ezreal's big power spike throughout a lot of these games is the exact time where Lucian wants to take over the game. And so overall, I think it's fine for Gen.G, and I get, by the way, the draft for them as well, because, scaling is kind of the name of the game when it comes to Gen.G. If they can just, I don't know, not take some horrendous 2v5 or 3v5 fights and then play for late game, they could have a chance of winning this, but they completely lost their minds and just kind of ran in and died over and over again. So we'll go ahead and talk about it. Player of the game is honestly kind of tough because I don't think anybody on T1 really did anything exceptional in this game. Not to say that they played bad. I'm serious. All 5 players played really well, but I don't think any of them did anything that was like, you saved the game or you individually created the advantage. I think this was more a team effort from T1 constantly being in the right place and then doing a great job of, as I said, capitalizing on mistakes that Gen.G was making. I think the person who probably benefited the most from that was Doran in the top lane on the Ornn. I thought this was a pretty good Ornn game outside of the early game, and even then it's Ornn in the early game. I'm not blaming him for that kind of problem, but Doran played these team fights out really well. He was a big problem in the later part of this game. Nobody could really side lane against him with the amount of gold that he had, and the ornaments made this basically impossible for Gen.G to come back in, which is never really ideal. This Ornn has been really successful for LCK teams, for T1, for Gen.G, for Hanwha Life, for whoever wants to pick it up. Ornn has been a very good pick for LCK teams throughout this year, and I think this was just another example. But if you wanted to give player of the game to Owner or Gumayushi, I think that's also fair. Owner had some incredible engages in this game. I think his positioning was about as perfect as you could ask for from a jungler. His form looks to be incredible at the current moment. Guma was outputting damage, certainly not like a regular Lucian would be able to do. It's funny because, Guma, I think this year has become even more specialized in terms of the role that he ends up filling for T1. Not that that's a bad thing, just that I think he's gone back to his comfort zone a little bit more than normal with things like Caitlyn and Lucian and Kalista being a lot more popular for him, wanting to play for that early game strength. He's not, Misfortune's another one. He's not really the guy who's going to be picking up Kaisa anymore. It's just not really how Guma wants to play the game, it would seem, which I think is kind of funny, but he can still carry in the late game on Lucian, again, if he has the gold, which he did in this game. Faker had a solid one on Talia, was definitely in more places than Chovy was, who had a pretty bad game on the other side. Carry was solid on the Braum, can't really, overhype him. He had a nice concussive blow to kill, I believe it was Canyon, or maybe it was Keen in one of these fights, just, be able to catch people out. It's just, it was a great game from T1 across the board. They were the better team. And for Gen.G, what happened, man? Like, I can't even begin to explain how this game ended up devolving in the way that it did. Surely Gen.G knew when they drafted Rumble, Rise, Skarner that they were playing for late game, and yet somehow they felt the need to not only contest every single objective in the game, because they absolutely contested every single objective. They contested Grubs, they contested first Drake, they contested second Drake, but a lot of these contests were not only poorly set up by Gen.G, but not set up at all, especially that second Drake, where it's literally just Canyon and Chovy standing there against 5 members of T1, while Keen tries to teleport in, and all of them just die instantly. It's a completely puzzling play. I can't imagine ever attempting to contest there. It just feels like they completely lost their brains. If they just give over those objectives like they did in game number 1, by the way, don't forget that they gave over Grubs and First Dragon in game number 1 because they were in a position where they knew they could win team fights in the mid game. If they just gave over those objectives and started to scale and let the game game, be a 500 to 1K gold lead for T1 rather than, balloon out of control. Do they lose this game? Like, it's just, I don't understand why you would ever make that decision. It was completely game altering in terms of how bad it was. Now, you do have to give credit where credit is due. T1 did a great job of capitalizing on it, but I think this was much more about Gen.G throwing the game than it was about T1, like, pushing them into bad decisions. It's completely inexcusable for them to make the mistakes that they did throughout game number 2. Dud of the game can go in a lot of different directions. Canyon and Chovy very much earned it in terms of just their raw decision making. If you're going to play Skarner Rise and you're going to contest every objective, certainly don't do it 2v5. Like, there's really no explanation for that. Chovy played some fights really well, but it didn't really matter, right? Like, the decision making behind those fights was so poor. Canyon was just bad throughout the entirety of this game, just looked really lost. But I'm giving Dud of the game to Keen. I get it, man. He had a 2K gold lead at one point in this game over Doran, and that's huge. But at the end of the day, he had all that gold on Rumble, and for what? He was constantly out of position every single fight. He was targeted first, and I get it. Like, you're Rumble, like, you're probably going to be closer to the front line than most of the other targets that, T1's going to be able to go for, and if he's going to get prioritized in some of these exchanges because he has the gold, it's going to be difficult for him to survive. But you have to understand that if you're Rumble and you get stunned up to the point where you can't press R in a team fight, you're playing it wrong. Like, just end of story. There's nothing to say. That didn't happen once. It didn't happen twice. It happened 3 times. He died with Equalizer up. It's completely unacceptable for Keen, who needs to be in a better spot than this. He was a way out of this game for them, even if it was a very shallow one, and he completely sold it. But the entire top side just completely ran it. Ruler and Duro didn't have any, problems making, mistakes. Like, they weren't all that bad in this game in terms of how things went. It was really just the top side of the map that sold things, and the decision making. It was the shot calling from Gen.G that instantly lost them this game. But all that did is turn this into a banger. All that did is turn this into a 1-1 series where we're tied up going into game number 3. And as you guys know, this is the most important game of the series for me. Whoever takes this has a much easier time in the back half of the series. And I think statistically, it's really advantageous to win this game number 3, to go into that game 4 and game 5 already up in the series 2-1. So who's going to be able to take it? Well, the winner of game number 3 was Gen.G. They are going to take game number 3. They're going to go back up in this series 2-1, and they're going to do it with the most Gen.G performance you could have ever expected. If game 2 was super out of pocket, super uncharacteristic for Gen.G, then here you go. This is LCK 101 in terms of how to play the game. It's draft this comp that has, a ton of macro threat, that has Pantheon, that has Galio, that can really arrive anywhere, that has Senna ultimate, that can really change any fight at any given moment. Draft that, and then play incredibly slow, incredibly methodical League of Legends, because you outscale with Senna throughout a lot of the back half of this game, and basically force T1 into a situation where they can't even play the game. Like, there's nothing that T1 could do in this. I'll be entirely frank with you guys. I don't think T1 made any mistakes in this game. I think there were some things that were wrong, and obviously the draft, I think, could have been improved at least a little bit, but like, they didn't really do anything all that bad throughout this game. There's just nothing to do. Gen.G ends up basically playing this perfectly and ends up setting up their comp in a perfect way, and T1 have no answer to it on the Rift. They just kind of have to sit there and watch themselves lose, because there's no play that they can make that would actually help their game out, and I'll kind of talk about that as we continue to go along. But this is the Gen.G that we saw all year. Like, if there's ever been, people who don't watch the LCK and only watch these international tournaments, and they wonder, why do people hype up Gen.G so much when they always go international and look, good, but maybe not unbelievable, right? Like, T1 looks like the team that's unbeatable from the LCK, right? This is the Gen.G we get to see all year long, where it's just like, what do you even do? Like, how do you ever beat this team? Like, what is there ever even to do in this comp? So, like, credit to them. Like, I think giving Gen.G a macro duo of Pantheon and Galio in draft is paramount to just instantly losing the game, because what ended up happening for T1 in this game, and the reason that I disagree with a lot of the hot takes online, and generally I understand that these are coming from impassioned T1 fans that maybe don't have, like, respect, all due respect in the world, that maybe don't have, like, the deepest understanding of why things are positive or negative for the game. Like, if T1 wants to be more aggressive here, which is what everyone said, is like, why is T1 just rolling over and dying? Why are they not trying to take these fights? If T1 tries to push their advantage anywhere on the map, Pantheon and Galio both instantly show up and the game is over. Now, if T1 plays slow and patient like they did in the game, because they know that if they try to make plays in side lanes, that Pantheon Galio is just instantly going to win the game. Well, now you have a Senna that completely outscales, and Gen.G's teamfight execution is better than T1's as a team. Like, that's just how they are, especially from neutral, and you also lose the game. Like, this is such a horrible situation for T1 to be in, and this is only possible because of just how good Gen.G is at playing slow games, and it's how you capitalize on your own playstyle. I think it's gorgeous gameplay from T1. I'm sorry, from Gen.G, not from T1. That's the exact opposite. It was fine from T1. They didn't really do anything wrong. But Gen.G is just, I mean, this is best team in the world material, and it goes back to the Pantheon Galio in draft. I think the Senna is brilliant here. Allow Ruler to be your late game win condition. I've talked about this so much at this tournament. There is one comp that has dominated things over others, and it's not indexing super heavily into early game. As long as you can have some sort of out in the late game, specifically if you have a bunch of frontliners, because in this game it's basically 4 tanks plus Senna. Like, if you can do that, like, it's really hard to beat that for anybody at this tournament, and I think this became even more clear. 4 tanks plus hyper carry does seem to be very strong in the meta right now, but for T1, I like their draft. I think generally speaking, it's honestly fine. People are going to clown on the Misfortune pick, but it only really didn't work out because Gen.G is as good as they are. Guma actually had some really great ult angles throughout this game. He just wasn't doing any damage because the game stalled out long enough for it not to matter. I think the biggest problem for T1 is that their bot lane lost early, and honestly, that's entirely to the credit of Duro, who had an unbelievable game here on Alistar. If T1's bot lane is up in gold, I think this game is a little more playable, and you probably don't look at Misfortune as a champion that tickles in the late game, but when Senna Alistar is generating lane priority into Misfortune Bard, you know something's gone atrociously wrong, and the bot gap right now in this series has kind of been pretty large. I think through the 2 wins, Ruler and Duro have absolutely been better than Gumayushi and Keria. And it's with both of those players on some of their signature champions. Duro's player of the game, by the way. This guy played unreal on the Alistar. This was an absolutely unbelievable game from him. I don't think he's going to get the credit he deserves, but he solo won lane for Senna against Misfortune Bard, which is just not possible. Like, that should never happen in a million years. But he solo won the lane. If you go back and watch the 2v2, the amount of pressure he was putting on that MF and the amount of movement that he had in the mid game to be able to keep Canyon from really falling behind in any sense to this Xin Zhao, like, he basically generated 1 to 1.5k gold in a gold lead for Gen.G by himself, not because he got it, but because he got it for his teammates. This was one of those games where it just goes to show that Duro is not a liability for this team. He is just as much of a reason that they went undefeated as anybody else is right now in terms of his gameplay. Unreal stuff from Duro on the Alistar. Obviously, interrupting the Misfortune ult around that fight with Dragon also was ginormous, and that really sealed the game for Gen.G. You do have to give credit to Ruler as well, though. I mean, you want to talk about the damage in the late game. This comp doesn't work if Ruler's not playing well on Senna. Ends up being in a really great spot. Just ends up one-shotting people by the end of the game. Absolutely ridiculous damage. The healing coming through from Senna as well to be able to keep these 4 tanks topped off at every single fight. Absolutely unreal. Chovy had a great game on Galio. This was a Galio masterclass from him. Canyon was awesome on Pantheon. Keen Sante, you know, he got his signature pick here, and it's really good into Sion. It's one of the best counter matchups into Sion in the meta. Like, it's just a Gen.G masterclass. Like, I hate to glaze, but they deserved it in game 3. And then for T1, like, what do you do? What do you even do this game? Like, there's no way to win this. There's actually just no way. If Gen.G plays like this, it's lost. Like, it's just doomed, and I hate to say that, but, like, there's no play here that could have saved the game. There's no, oh, if they didn't do this, or if they could have done this, they could have won. There just isn't anything for me to say in that regard. Guma's gonna get dud of the game because the Misfortune did absolutely nothing, and I think Guma losing laning phase and losing prio to Ruler on this Senna was a disaster for T1. It gave away really their only shot to actually stay, like, kind of neutral throughout a lot of this game, but, like, how much of that is even Guma's fault? Duro was just the best player in the bot lane. Doran had a couple of big mistakes throughout this game as well. Maybe you could criticize Owner, but, like, what play did he go for that was bad? Faker didn't make any mistakes. His positioning was really good throughout this game. Keria had a couple of moments on Bard that were really solid. It just didn't really matter. It's a signature champion. Like, T1 weren't in this, and it's not their fault. Gen.G was just better, and that gives me confidence that Gen.G can move forward, but as we know, this team is not consistent internationally. They have to keep their foot on the gas. They have to play more games like this. They can't go back to what they were in game 2. They have to be what they were in game 3. But T1, they're at their best when their back's up against the wall. And now we're going into game 4 with them down 2-1. We'll see if they can respond or if Gen.G, if Chovy can pick up his first ever international series win over Faker here in game 4. Can T1 keep it alive, or is Gen.G going to close it out? The winner of game number 4 was T1. They are going to take game number 4. They're going to even up the series at 2 apiece, and we are heading to a Silver Scrapes game number 5, because of course we are, between these two teams. I'm trying not to spoil this throughout the entire video, but, like, if you expected anything other than 5 games between T1 and Gen.G, I don't know what to tell you, man. They just always do this. They always do this every year, every time they play against each other. It is a 5-game set, and it is ridiculously close. It's super fun to watch, but, you know, definitely back back and forth, we'll just say, in terms of the actual quality of this series. That being said, this was a really good game from both teams. I honestly think this could be considered the highest quality series across this tournament so far. Gen.G versus AL, I think, is the only other one that's had really high quality gameplay, but I think Gen.G was definitely better in that series than anyone's Legend was. I just think that Tarzan was really good for AL, and so they kind of, it balanced it out a little bit in terms of being able to, keep fighting, but this is probably the best that, both teams have looked throughout this entire tournament, which is a really good sign, I think, for both of them to be able to level up in the most important moments. This really came down to the wire. This was a super tense back and forth game between these two. It really felt like Gen.G had control of the game until they didn't anymore, until, unfortunately Canyon gets caught out being a little bit too greedy later on in the game around, I believe it was that soul fight for Gen.G. It might have been just after the soul fight for Gen.G, or just after they took Ocean Soul. Canyon just way too quick on the fight, ends up being a little too aggressive and ends up, really running the game down for Gen.G. There were some mistakes outside of that as well, but for the most part, this was just a really nice game from both of these teams. T1 had a pretty big lead, but Gen.G stayed alive. They kept fighting. The Callista actually looked super relevant throughout a lot of this game. It felt like Ruler was finally going to break the winless Callista curse, and then it just comes crashing down in the end. T1 outplays some of those final team fights, like I said earlier, just some mistakes coming in from Gen.G that end up really being a bit of a problem for them, and T1 end up taking the game. No flame in the world to either team. There's going to be some flame to some individual mistakes that Gen.G made, but again, very high quality game, very high quality series up until this point. When it comes to draft, pretty easy to kind of talk about where things went right or wrong. People are going to criticize the Ahri Callista carry duo here for Gen.G. I think if there was ever an angle to pick it, this is absolutely the angle. I think not only is it Chovy's Ahri, it's one of his best champions, and we know that, and Faker has honestly struggled playing into Ahri throughout not only this year, but parts of his career. It's been something that he actually hasn't had a ton of success against in terms of the numbers at the very least, and I can remember some vivid games where Faker kind of got outplayed by a couple of Ahri players, but Ruler is arguably the best Callista of all time, and so if anybody was ever going to be able to break the Callista curse, it's probably going to be him. I can vividly think back to like 2020 and 2021 when he was getting Callista bans when that champion was complete dog water, and it's just kind of funny how that ends up working out because, Ruler's just that good at Callista, but can't quite carry the game here, comes very, very close. I think the big plus for Gen.G's draft here is not only the Poppy on R2, but being willing to flex that into the top lane, because Poppy is really good into Gragas. I think that's a great matchup for Keem early on in the game, and I think Zed's kind of really strong in this draft. I think it's a great R5 pick for Canyon. There were times where he looked great on it, times where he did not look so great on it. I think naturally Assassins are just going to be more hit or miss when it comes to their actual performance at tournaments like this, but playing off of the Zed Ahri mid-jungle duo, Callista potentially getting a bunch of kills in the early game, which absolutely happened. Gen.G had avenues to win this. I just think T1 also got a comp that they're unbelievably familiar with. Obviously, they outscale here because they're playing Orianna Corki, and they're always going to have more damage in the late game, but Orianna Nocturne, like that's the combo. Doran on Gragas, that's obviously a big, big W for T1, and anybody who knows Doran definitely knows that. He's very famous for this champion, and so, T1 kind of getting a lot of things that they probably wanted to get in game 4, and they executed on it really well. I think it really just came down to a lot of the late game team fights where T1 just ended up playing a little bit better. Doran is going to get my player of the game. There were a couple of moments in this game where he just completely blew the game wide open. A couple of moments where he whiffed ultimates, and that kind of allowed Gen.G to be able to posture back up, but I think the angles he was looking for in those instances really weren't all that bad, and the entire game should not have been on the Gragas in the top lane, yet it kind of was in terms of where a lot of these casks were landing and a lot of these engages were landing. Doran ended up, really coming through in the most clutch moments, and again, he just kind of does this on this champion. I think it was a bit of a mistake to give him the Gragas and allow him to be able to take over in the way that he did, but what do I know? Doran has a lot of matchups that I think are quite good. I think this guy's always been underrated, and Poppy's a very good answer to the Gragas for the most part, especially going into the late game, so really didn't feel all that bad about this draft. Doran just played it expertly. But if you wanted to give player of the game to Gumayushi, I mean, come on, man. Like, this was the best game he's played all series by a large margin. This Corki was absolutely pumping out damage in the back half of this game. Ruler played incredible on the Callista, and I still think he's been the better AD carry in this series, but Guma was finally better than him here in game number 4, and that's with Ruler stepping up and being so good on the other side of this. But, I mean, there were times where Guma was legit doing like 10 to 12,000 damage in a team fight. It's actually just absurd how much damage this Corki was pumping out. Doran and Guma basically played all of these late game team fights perfectly, and that was the reason T1 was able to win. A couple of huge shockwaves coming in from Faker, but I think the bigger impact that Faker had throughout this, game, I guess, throughout the back half of this game, the team fight stage, was the pinpoint stopwatches. He was able to hit the pinpoint Zhonyas, 2 different ones that he was able to hit when Chovy found some fantastic flank angles onto him. He was instantaneously able to react with a couple of those Zhonyas, and that basically saved the game for T1, so Faker with the quick reaction time really stepping up and then being able to obviously change the game with a couple of stopwatches. Keria was good on the Karma, didn't really have to do all that much, really was just there to make sure Guma could carry the game, and Owner couldn't do anything on Nocturne in the later part of the game. Quite frankly, that champion just became entirely irrelevant. He became a turn out the lights button, but outside of that, this was a Doran and Gumayushi game that they ended up carrying, and they just had the best performances in the back half, and that's not against Gen.G, because Ruler tried his best, man. He had an unbelievable game on Kalista, easily the best Kalista game of the tournament. Up until this point, it just wasn't enough. He wasn't able to solo carry the game. He showed why, Kalista's perma-banned against Ruler in a lot of scenarios, though, because he really is that great at this champion. It's just the rest of the team had moments where they were out of position. Again, we talked about Canyon's big int around Sol, or at least right after Sol, where he was just way too far forward, played the fight way too fast, and ended up getting caught out, turned it into a 4v5 that really put Gen.G on the back burner for the rest of the game. But, Chovy and Duro, I think they're the 2 players that you're really looking at saying you needed to be better. Now, Chovy was pretty good through the back end of the game. I think people are going to be a bit confused why I'm giving him dead of the game. It's mostly for second and third Drake fights where he actually really misplayed in a lot of those instances. I know people don't really remember the second and third Drake because overall, the game just went so long that a lot more stuff actually happened, and Chovy really didn't make any mistakes in the actual back half of the game when it really mattered. In fact, he had a couple of unbelievably good flank angles where, again, if he ends up landing those charms onto Faker, if Faker's not able to instantaneously Zhonya's and kind of shut off Chovy's engage, I think Gen.G just straight up win the game. I think those are game-winning plays from Chovy where Faker was just a little bit better in those instances, but those plays didn't land, and Chovy wasn't doing enough damage in the late game because he's Ahri trying to go into a comp that's really good at playing front to back, and that's really difficult for Chovy to play out. So he is dead of the game because he misplayed in the early game, allowed T1, to kind of get a foothold in, and then eventually wasn't useful enough, wasn't really a big game changer in the back half of the game. Chovy needs to be better than he was here in game number 4. Again, even if I don't think it was entirely his fault, Duro had some incredible plays at the beginning of this game and then completely ran it for the entire back half. His Renata was terrible in these team fights. He absolutely needed to be better than he was. Again, Canyon kind of ran it. Keen had a couple of moments where he was too far forward, but again, for the most part, Keen was actually pretty good in this game on the Poppy. He just probably needed to shut down Doran a little bit more, focus a bit more on that Gragas rather than, trying to prioritize the Nocturne in some of these engages. Ruler was trying to 1v9. He just couldn't quite get it done because Canyon was running it. I think they could have won the 2v8 if everything were to have gone right, but it just wasn't in the cards here. And now we're going into a game number 5, a Silver Scrapes game 5. This is where both of these teams live. T1 internationally has been so dominant in these clutch moments. They're the most clutch team of all time, and it's not even particularly close. And then you have Gen.G, who have kind of been game 5 merchants over the course of this year. They took down Hanwha Life in a game 5. They were able to go to 5 against Nongshim and be able to recover and recuperate in the spring split, or the winter split, I should say. This is a team that's also done really well in game 5s, and so really excited to see, can Gen.G overcome their demons and win in a clutch manner, or will T1 do it again and keep Gen.G down for yet another winners finals? Well, the winner of game number 5 was Gen.G. They are going to take game number 5. They are going to take this series 3-2, and they will move on to the finals of MSI. They will defeat T1 and be crowned the unofficial, but actually official LCK champions. I know that a lot of people were kind of treating this as a finals, me included, and I think they did kind of live up to that billing. This series was a banger. This was the most fun game 5 of the tournament up until this point, and this series was probably the best gameplay that we had seen throughout this tournament. So really excited to see that both of these teams are leveling up. I think there's even a case to be made that T1 was the better team in this series as a whole. They just couldn't close it out. You want to talk about clutch moments? Well, Gen.G stepped up in the clutch moments, and T1 kind of made some gigantic mistakes in a really clutch game number 5 that they absolutely should have won. And now all of a sudden the series is over. T1 has to go down to the lower bracket. Maybe this was all intentional. Maybe they're going down there to beat up on anyone's legend, or Billy. I guess technically BLG can win, but beat up on whoever comes out of that series and then get themselves back into finals with more momentum and be able to take that. I think that's a reasonable thing that could happen, but either way, these probably could be the 2 best teams in the world right now, especially when T1 is in form. But let's go ahead and talk about the drafts. I really like the drafts from both of these teams. I think both of them have a lot going for them. Gen.G is really indexing heavily into this idea that, it's Canyon Nidalee, and as long as he can play, the Canyon Nidalee game and get Keen really fed on arguably his best champion, maybe outside of Cassante, in Renekton, people forget just how good this guy was on Renekton from like 2018 to 2022 or 2023. This guy was playing Renekton every game and dominating everything on it. I know it's not exactly been the most recent champion that he's dominated on, but his Renekton has always been one of his scariest picks, and so to get these two on some comfort picks and then to still have that scaling out in the late game with the Jinx, I think is a very smart strategy. I really like this idea of having enough pressure to be able to generate leads in the early game while also not giving over this idea of just not scaling, like indexing entirely into having to win the game early because you don't have any late game damage. I think this draft is generally good for that. And for T1 on the other side, I think their draft is underratedly good. I think there are some things that people have talked about with this draft that I completely disagree with. I think the only lane that I'm really looking at that concerns me is top lane. I think Mbessa is just not really a great R3 here as the answer to Renekton. Mbessa really needs to be able to establish pressure in the 1v1 in lane, and she needs to be able to fight. And I think if you are putting a lot of attention, like you should be, into this Renekton Nidalee duo, then it's hard for Mbessa to really have that same kind of pressure. She's not going to scale all that efficiently into the late game. We'll talk about some mistakes that Doran obviously made, but that's really the only part of the draft that I'm not a huge fan of. I think with Lee Sin on R1, answering it with Nidalee, that's pretty Lee Sin favored, especially because it's owner's Lee Sin. People have been talking about how Sylas into Aurora is a bad Sylas matchup. Okay, maybe in isolation, that's a bad Sylas matchup, but the moment Lee Sin has any semblance of pressure in the early game, Sylas should dominate this 1v1. Maybe not dominate, but Sylas should win the 1v1 because Lee Sin's gonna have pressure, and that's exactly what happened, and we'll talk about that. Faker was down in resources and gold throughout a lot of this game. We'll talk. I think people are going to get confused by my dead of the game, but I promise I'll explain it. This is not a bad matchup for Faker. In fact, I would argue that I would expect Sylas to be up in gold into Aurora with the game set up the way that it is, I should say. And then Guma and Keria are in a great spot to just be able to dominate the early laning phase. This is a super aggressive 2v2, and really it's just like hoping and praying that Jinx can survive into the late game, which obviously does end up happening. But like T1 have all the tools necessary to win this game, and through the first 15 minutes, it looked over. Like, genuinely, I almost turned off the game. Like, I was genuinely like, it's doomed. Like, there's no way for T1. I was like, I'll finish it in the morning. Like, there's no way for T1 to be able to win this. It's 1 a.m. or 12:30 or whatever. I'm going to bed. And then T1 makes the most boneheaded decision that I've ever seen, where Doran full engages on a Tom Kench 4v5, instantly dies. Owner goes in and dies alongside him. And all of a sudden, Gen.G are in a position where they actually can fight. But really, everyone's going to look at Doran and say, like, oh, you threw the game at that moment. The game is very much still winnable for T1 from that section. What ends the game is the Otacon fight. Like, that is instantly game over for T1, and the big problem in that Otacon fight was Faker, in my opinion. What happened to this guy's brain in that fight? He Aurora ults after Owner, by the way, just walks up and gets rooted by the Jinx traps. What are you thinking, dude? You just instantly killed yourself and threw the entire fight away. But then Faker, who, by the way, at this point is down 1.5k gold on Chovy in a matchup that I think he should be up in. Faker uses Aurora ultimate, immediately teleports to the other side and gets himself rooted on Jinx Trap and just instantly dies. It's one of the worst plays I've ever seen Faker make, and I think it was genuinely game losing. I know not a lot of people probably caught that because Owner's int was a little bit more, like, obvious, but honestly, Faker's was worse. Like, he absolutely threw this game away in that fight. The execution on that was just tremendously horrible, and it's so out of character for Faker to make a gigantic mistake like that in such a big moment. I just don't really understand. At least Doran was like okay in the early game, and Owner obviously completely gapped Canyon in the early game, which is what saved him from getting dead of the game. He was up so many resources. He destroyed this Nidalee pick. It was completely useless throughout the beginning part of the game, but Faker was down in resources in a matchup that I think he should have been good in, and I think he made the biggest mistake of the game, just randomly killing himself at that Otacon fight. It's just absurd. So pretty poor execution by T1. They just made some gigantic mistakes, and then from that point onwards, the Jinx's Mega Fed can just instantly win the game, and that's why Ruler's player of the game for me. He absolutely deserves this, and he's player of the series as well. I know Duro probably should get it, at least in terms of my grading scale. He ends up grading out better in this series than Ruler did, but Ruler popping off in this game number 5 is what won them the series. If he doesn't do this, they don't win. It doesn't matter what else happened in the rest of the series. So Ruler's getting player of the series. I'm overriding my own little grading scale here. But, I mean, what a Jinx game. Completely glided the end half of that game. Do I think he was perfect? No. Like, I think the early game could have been a little bit better from him. But the Dragon Steal, I think, is ginormous for Ruler. That actively saved the game for Gen.G, even though we didn't know it at the time. That was absolutely gigantic from him. And then, obviously, him getting super fed and getting those resets and, you know, getting excited in these team fights was really kind of the big saving grace for Gen.G. They played towards their Jinx win condition, and it absolutely worked out. I just want to say this, a little bit of an aside. I am so tired of hearing, oh, you know, this is the best series Ruler's played all year. How many times can we say that? How many times are we going to say that before we just remember that Ruler actually is a good player? I'm so tired of the forced Ruler hate narrative. I can't deal with this shit, man. Like, honestly, it really does get me upset. Duro obviously has also been great throughout a lot of this year, but I think both of them were top 5-ish players in the LCK this year. The Ruler narrative, I've never understood. I've pushed back on it a ton, having watched every game on this channel. I don't know what you want of him. Again, are you comparing him to Jesus? Like, what? I don't know what we're expecting of this guy. All he does is step up when he needs to. And yeah, has he taken a back seat in some moments? Is he caught out a little too far forward sometimes? Yes. How is that any different than what Ruler is at his prime? Like, I don't understand, but whatever. Ruler was awesome in this series. You know, he kind of proved that he was, you know, a player who could step up in big moments like we already knew. And then Duro was obviously great as well. The bot lane, too, like the bot lane was the best part of Gen.G. Chovy had some moments in this series that were good, had some moments that were bad. I think people are dogging on him too much again for this performance. He still was up like 2k gold in a bad matchup in this game. And that was a big reason why T1 ended up losing, because Faker was so out of the game and the Sylas, you know, made some mistakes that really couldn't take over the fights. But the Ahri game wasn't great. He didn't really carry on the Aurora. I think he took more of a back seat here. Even the Annie game that they ended up winning, he was definitely more of a facilitative piece in that game. It's interesting to see how Gen.G plays around other pieces, but they realize that, at least in this meta, it's easier to play around hyper carries in the bot lane than it is to play around hyper carries in the mid lane. They're correct for identifying that. It just kind of means to the detriment of Chovy's actual performances. Canyon tried his absolute best to lose this series. I'm honestly a little bit upset at him because he had a really bad game number 5 on his signature champion, but we'll let it slide because he ended up turning into a glorified enchanter for Jinx in the end of the game. And Keen was really good in the beginning of this series, made some mistakes in the back half, but overall was good enough to win. And like I said for T1, if they just don't make those mistakes at the end, if Doran, Owner, and Faker don't completely run it in those two team fights, Doran obviously ulting the Tahm Kench and dying, Owner stepping on the trap around Otacon and instantly killing himself, and then Faker being down a ton of gold and then, you know, just instantly dying, and Aurora ulting himself into his own death when he probably could have taken over that team fight. Like, all of those things just didn't need to happen for T1 to win the game. Guma had a great game on Draven. I knew this Draven was coming in the moment we got through that second ban phase. It was so obvious to me. I was honestly shocked the casters didn't mention it. And then Keria gets to play his Pyke on R5. They were good in this game. They did everything they were supposed to, but the top side of the map really let them down. But this was really a close series, and this is the best series of MSI so far in terms of actual gameplay. These are maybe the two best teams at the tournament. T1 will get the chance to prove that going up against the winner of Anyone's Legend and Billy Gaming, but what we kind of knew going into the tournament has been proven true. Gen.G is the team to beat at the very least. I'm not saying that they definitely are going to win, but they are the favorites now going into it, even if you can argue T1 had better execution throughout a lot of this series. And Gen.G has finally overcome their demons. They beat T1 in a best of 5 internationally. This organization as Gen.G, as Generation Gaming, has never done that. It's been, you know, the Samsung teams that have been able to do that, but Gen.G had never been able to do it. Chovy had never been able to beat Faker in an international best of 5. And even if you want to sit here and say that he didn't, you know, do it off the back of him, that it was Ruler and it was Duro that really stepped up here today, what you can't, you know, take away from them is the fact that they finally got that monkey off their back, and that might be enough for them to run the rest of this tournament. All right, but that is going to do it for my MSI Winners Finals overview and analysis video. Gen.G is going to move on to the Grand Finals of MSI. They only have one more series to play, and they have a chance to become the back-to-back MSI champions. T1, of course, not out just yet. They move down to the lower bracket, and they do so in pretty great form. It's really going to be interesting to see if they can keep that form up. They've always been the LPL killers. It's really hard to imagine a different scenario here, but it will be an LPL team, because in our round 3 matchup here, we have Billy Gaming taking on Anyone's Legend. The two teams obviously coming out of the lower side of the bracket, and this should be a pretty easy series to predict. These two teams have played a lot over the course of this year, and AL has been the better of these two teams almost every time that they have played. AL is not only in better form right now, BLG's weaknesses have been really exposed, and AL have a lot of the mental advantage against BLG. I wouldn't be surprised if this is like a 3-0, but expect AL 3-1. I think that's my prediction here. That just generally feels like what's going to happen. Again, if it's a sweep, I'm really not going to be shocked. If it goes to 5, I'm not going to be stunned. If BLG win, that's going to be a bit more surprising. I think AL have all of the tools necessary to be able to pretty cleanly pick up this victory, and that would lead to AL versus T1, which is really the matchup I think we all want to see. I want to see Tarzan versus Faker in an international best of 5, but let me know if you agree or disagree with my takes down in the comment section below. Do you think it will be AL pretty cleanly? Do you think BLG has a chance? And who do you think is going to be making it out of the lower bracket? Do you think it will be AL or BLG, or do you think T1 has this in the bag, considering how good they looked against Gen.G? I'm curious to know your thoughts and opinions down below, but that's going to do it. I do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. It lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. Of course, we're covering every series the rest of MSI. 3 series remaining. Round 3, semifinals, and finals, but after that, we're jumping back into regional analysis for all 4 of the major regions, as we always do. So if you want a comprehensive overview of everything going on in LoL Esports, including the rest of MSI, this is the place for it. Hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all